Coming up, another episode of The Deep Dive, exploring radical ideas. A podcast produced by Bob Rash.
That delivers a logical analysis of objective reality, grounded in rational principles. We will explore relevant facts and radical ideas based on the axiomatic principles of identity, causality, and consciousness, on reason as an absolute, on rational self-interest as a moral guide, and on the ideals of privacy, freedom, and justice.
Okay, let's dive into a really fascinating source we have today. It's a book by Roberto Rachewsky, and what makes it stand out, I think, is how it uses Ayn Rand's philosophy, Objectivism. It uses it as the central framework, the glue, as our source puts it, to connect some seriously big topics.
Right. It takes material the author developed over time, articles and reflections, and uses this very specific philosophical lens to bring everything into focus.
Exactly. So our deep dive today is going to explore the core ideas of objectivism, but specifically as presented in this book. Then we'll trace this sweeping path through the history of philosophy and civilization, again, importantly, seen through the author's specific lens. And finally, we'll zero in on the unique, often challenging history of the liberal movement in Brazil, all through the author's perspective and the insights he draws from his sources.
And our mission here is really to extract the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from this material. It's designed to give you a kind of shortcut to understanding these complex connections and, hopefully spark a few genuine aha moments along the way.
Yeah, and it's really crucial to remember throughout this deep dive that we are presenting the information as it appears in this source material. We're trying to understand its specific viewpoints and arguments. Not necessarily endorse them, just understand them.
Definitely. And the book lays out a key framework right near the beginning, something it calls the 3 A's, Aristotle, Aquinas, and Ayn Rand.
Ah, yes. That triad really gives you a hint of the intellectual journey we're about to take.
This book, it really begins from a personal place for the author. It grew out of various writings, but he found that Ayn Rand's objectivism had such a profound, life-changing impact on him that it just naturally became the organizing principle, the philosophical structure holding all his thoughts together.
And the book's goal, as he states it, it's much more than just introducing objectivism to a Brazilian audience, right?
Right. It's framed as a direct invitation to you, the reader, and for us, the listener. An invitation to actively use your mind, to think objectively, explore challenging concepts, maybe abandon unquestioned dogmas, and ultimately understand how we've arrived at our current place in history so that we can work towards transforming the world into a truly free and safe environment for individual happiness. That's the big goal presented.
And objectivism itself, as this source presents it.
Yeah. Well, it isn't just a political theory or some kind of self-help manual.
No, not at all. It's described as a complete, integrated philosophy. It offers principles intended to guide each individual in living the best life they possibly can.
And the idea is that any improvement in society happens as a consequence of individuals improving themselves first. Is that fair?
That's the core idea presented, yes.
Yeah.
It starts with the individual. And the source really hammers home the critical importance of consciousness and thinking in this philosophy. It's not automatic.
Right. It takes work. It requires active will, discipline, focused effort. It involves perceiving what's out there, identifying what it is, and then abstracting to understand its nature and how it relates to you, to the world.
So there's this constant question. From this perspective, does this thing, this action, this idea, does it promote life and flourishing or, destruction and death?
Exactly. That's the fundamental evaluation. And one interesting side note is the author's personal experience. He mentions being abroad for a while. He felt disconnected from the liberal movement back in Brazil and was genuinely surprised by what he saw as its decline after the economic stability brought by the Plano Rural in 1994.
Why surprise?
Well, it seemed to him that many who had supported the movement sort of believed their work was done. Goals achieved, stability reached, so they just shifted their focus entirely to their businesses, stepping away from the ideological fight as he saw it.
Interesting. Okay, so how does this philosophy Objectivism actually break down? You mentioned the department store analogy earlier.
Yeah, the book uses that. It's quite helpful. Imagine a department store with different floors representing the main branches of philosophy.
Okay, ground floor.
Ground floor is metaphysica. Metaphysics. This deals with the fundamental nature of reality, the core question. What exists?
And the answer.
The source quotes Ayn Rand stating a fundamental axiom of objectivism. Existence is identity. Consciousness is identification.
Okay. Existence is identity. Consciousness is identification. What does that mean in practice?
It means reality exists independently of us. Existence is. It has primacy. Our consciousness doesn't create reality. Its job is to perceive and identify what is.
Got it. Reality first.
Right. And from that premise, the source argues that for a human being to exist and survive, they must act according to their nature, and that nature requires the use of reason.
Which takes us up a floor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Moving up to what the source calls the most essential branch, epistemology. How do we know things? How do we acquire and validate knowledge?
And this is crucial because
being human, having consciousness and this faculty of reason, is precisely what makes philosophy both possible and necessary for us. We need a way to know.
And the objectivist stance here, according to the source.
Very clear. Knowledge comes from this reality, the one we perceive through our senses and process with reason. It's not rooted in the supernatural. It's also explicitly not materialism in the sense of denying consciousness. And there's no mind-body split, no extracorporeal life, no reliance on divine revelations or faith for knowledge.
Okay. Grounded in reality. How does this distinguish humans from animals in the book's view?
That's a key distinction the source makes. It contends that humans don't operate on instincts, not in the way animals do, with those automatic pre-programmed responses. Actions driven purely by impulse or emotion can be controlled, the source argues, by regaining conscious focus. Humans possess free will.
Free will specifically meaning?
Specifically, the choice to focus their mind and the choice to think. Thinking isn't automatic like breathing. It's volitional. It requires conscious effort, discipline, focus.
And reason is the tool for that.
It's presented as the exclusive tool, the only means to perceive and understand reality, to form the concepts and abstractions we need, to guide our actions effectively, solve existential challenges, and ultimately pursue our own happiness.
The source mentions it can be difficult to become an objectivist.
Yeah, it notes that internalizing these ideas can be challenging. It might require significant mental effort to, as it puts it, deprogram one's mind from prevailing cultural influences, particularly those emphasizing collectivism or altruism, which are seen as contrary to this view.
So reason identifies values, but what about emotions?
Emotions are real and important, but they're seen as accessory in this framework. They're the fuel, the motivator maybe. But they must be kept in their proper place, guided by rational thought. They shouldn't dictate your actions or your values. Reason identifies the path. Emotions help you travel it.
And this connects to language.
Yes, the flow of information and life itself relies on forming concepts, which is unique to humans through language. So putting it together, metaphysics says we must act to exist. Epistemology says effective action requires the disciplined use of reason.
Which logically leads to ethics.
Precisely. The third floor, etica. Ethics. This branch asks the question, how should we live? It integrates the foundations of metaphysics, what is, and epistemology, how we know.
And the highest moral standard is?
Life itself. Within this philosophy, your own life, lived as a rational being, is held up as the ultimate value and standard.
So the role of ethics is?
To identify and establish the values that should guide our actions. The goal is self-preservation, the rational pursuit of self-interest, seeking the best and longest life one can live as a human being.
This sounds like rational egoism.
That's the term used, yes, acting guided by your own self-interest, but, and this is the crucial part, using reason as your guide and tool. The source presents this not just as an ethical stance, but as fundamentally existential. It's about what it means to live as a rational human in reality.
And virtues, are they duties?
No, that's a key point the author emphasizes, drawing directly from Rand. Virtues are presented as choices, not duties. The source quotes Rand, asserting that the very concept of duty actually destroys reason, undermines genuine values, corrupts love, and erodes self-esteem.
Why?
Because moral choices, from this perspective, must be based on a rational evaluation of reality and your own life, not on blind obedience to authority or some abstract sense of obligation.
And Rand identifies specific core values needed for living.
Yes. The source highlights 3 as pillars. Reason, as the indispensable instrument of knowledge. Purpose, which you choose consciously to achieve your own happiness. And self-esteem, the earned certainty that your mind is competent to deal with reality and that yourself is worthy of living and happiness.
And these values require virtues to be put into practice.
Exactly. They demand specific virtues. The source details 3 essential ones in Objectivism, presented as integrated and hierarchical.
What are they?
First is rationality. This is the fundamental commitment. Recognizing reason as your only source of knowledge, your only tool for judgment, your only guide for action.
And being irrational means?
In this view, it's not just making a mistake. It's a deeper refusing the premise that rationality is your means of survival. It's like refusing to see reality, refusing to learn, refusing to know what reality and logic offer for a better life.
Okay, rationality first. What's second?
Second is independencia, independence. This means using your own mind to deal with reality, making your own judgments based on your own rational assessment. It means setting aside faith, unexamined beliefs, or inherited dogmas unless you've personally evaluated them against reality and logic.
Does it have another aspect?
Yes. Independence also means sustaining your own life autonomously through your own effort, not depending on the sacrifice of others, nor demanding sacrifice from them, living by your own productive work.
Which leads directly to the third virtue.
Productivity. This is the virtue of maintaining your life materially by creating value. It involves applying your focused mind and your virtues, rationality, independence, to transforming nature, producing the goods and services necessary to sustain and enhance human life.
Okay, so we have reality, knowledge, ethics, and the key virtues. How does this apply to society? How should people live together?
Right, that takes us to the next logical branch, politics. The core question here, derived from the previous foundations, is how should human beings live together in a social context, given their nature as rational, independent, productive individuals?
And the answer, according to the source drawing from Objectivism,
is that only one political system is morally justifiable and practically possible based on this understanding of human nature and rights? Laissez-faire capitalism.
Laissez-faire.
Meaning a system completely free from government intervention in the economy. It's presented here as the radical and consistent application of inalienable individual rights to the realm of social interactions and potential conflicts.
That's a strong claim. How does it view civilization itself?
Through this specific lens, civilization is seen as the historical advancement towards a society based on privacy. Think about it. The life of a primitive, savage man, the source argues, is public, tribal, dictated by the group. Civilization, conversely, is the process of freeing man from the coercive demands and control of other men.
So interactions should be private.
Interpersonal relationships should be private, based on voluntary interaction, unless and until they involve a violation of individual rights like force or fraud.
And the government's role in this system?
Strictly limited. Its sole legitimate function, as defined in this philosophy, is to protect individual rights. Full stop.
How does it do that?
By retaliating only against those who initiate the use of physical force or fraud. The government holds a monopoly on the retaliatory use of force.
And the purpose of that?
To remove violence and coercion from social interactions, and critically, to ensure the existence of a truly free market.
A free market defined as?
Not just free from some government rules. A market free from violence in all its forms. That includes physical force, theft, fraud, breach of contracts, and government-initiated violence or coercion.
The source uses strong language about government overreach, doesn't it?
It does. It posits that in a true society of rational individuals, there's an implicit, fundamental contract. Life is the highest value, and existence is an inalienable right. If a government, supposedly established to protect these rights, instead initiates force and violates them, the source says it's not a government at all. It uses the term mafia.
Wow. It even questions how government should be funded.
Yes, it raises a provocative point. Logically, if the government's only legitimate role is protecting rights against coercion, the source suggests its funding should ideally be voluntary. Perhaps like paying for specific services like contract enforcement or court costs when you use the justice system.
A voluntary tax system.
Essentially, yes. Or systems based on fees for service. He notes that economists should explore voluntary funding models, adding, somewhat pointedly, that government in its current form is often the largest user of the judiciary and, in his view, the biggest violator of rights.
And this whole perspective is contrasted with other ways of thinking.
Sharply. The source contrasts this reality-based, reason-driven view with other schools of the thought it sees as prioritizing abstract theories a priorism over evidence from reality induction. These other perspectives, in the author's analysis, often favor things like religiosity, dogma, pure materialism, or a kind of detached spirituality.
And how do they view human nature, according to this critique?
They tend to view humans as fundamentally limited, maybe reactive, inherently sinful, or driven purely by irrational hedonism, not as fundamentally rational beings capable of self-direction.
And this leads them to advocate
Collectivism, seeing individual people merely as means to some greater end, like society or the state or the collective good, rather than as ends in themselves.
Okay, so having laid out these philosophical tools, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, the author then uses this lens to look at history.
Right. He traces a specific philosophical journey through history to understand from this perspective how we arrived at the modern world and its conflicts.
Starting with
Ancient Greece, naturally. He touches on early figures, but draws a really clear line of divergence between Plato and Aristotle.
how so?
Plato is presented as proposing two separate realities, the world of forms and the world we perceive, along with innate ideas disconnected from experience, and an ethics focused on something beyond earthly life. The sophists, on the other hand, are seen as denying objective reality altogether, making knowledge impossible and ethics purely subjective.
And Aristotle.
Aristotle is championed following Rand's interpretation as proposing the fundamental opposite. One objective reality, knowable through observation and logic, and crucially, an ethics aimed at achieving happiness in this life, specifically through the disciplined use of reason. He's positioned as the fighter against both the mystics and the skeptics.
Then came the decline.
The decline of the classical era is described through the lens of Rome's expansionism, growing statism, and creeping mysticism, leading eventually to its fall. Then, the rise of mysticism and the union of church and state meant Aristotle's reality-based approach was largely lost or suppressed in the West. Platonic ideas, fitting better with a focus on another realm, became dominant during the Middle Ages.
Which the source calls
An age of darkness, from this specific viewpoint, characterized by a focus on faith, obedience, altruism, and the afterlife, rather than earthly reason and individual flourishing.
until Aquinas.
Exactly. Here's where Thomas Aquinas becomes pivotal in this narrative. Building on Aristotle's works rediscovered via thinkers like Maimonides and Averroes, Aquinas is credited with rescuing Aristotle for the West.
His key contribution, according to the source,
Intellectually separating religion and reason, acknowledging their distinct domains. This act, the source argues, cracked open the door for the reemergence of reason, individual focus, and ultimately paved the way for the Renaissance.
and the Renaissance is seen as
A powerful return. Man back at the center, a renewed focus on this reality, on reason, and a celebration of the individual's potential. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, the genius applying reason to the world, and Galileo Galilei, pursuing scientific truth through observation, are highlighted.
and Galileo's conflict with the church.
Mentioned as a stark illustration of the resistance reason still faced from entrenched dogma.
Okay, so Aquinas' separation of reason and faith was key. How did that influence later thought?
The source traces a direct line from that distinction to key British thinkers who shaped the modern world. Francis Bacon, emphasizing empirical observation. Isaac Newton, applying reason to uncover natural laws. And especially John Locke.
Locke is crucial in this narrative.
Absolutely. Presented as the father of liberalism.
Yeah,
His ideas the mind as a blank slate, tabula rasa, learning from experience, the separation of religion and state, the fundamental defense of individual rights, life, liberty, property, are seen as direct intellectual descendants of this Aristotelian Thomist lineage.
influencing political events too.
Yes, his influence on things like the Glorious Revolution in England and the rise of constitutional monarchy is noted.
And this traveled across the Atlantic.
That's the argument. These ideas, Aristotelian realism, Thomistic reason-faith separation, Lockean individual rights, profoundly influenced the American founders, people like Jefferson and Madison. This influence, the source argues, led directly to the revolutionary idea of a constitutional republic founded explicitly on protecting individual rights, culminating in the U.S. Constitution.
Adam Smith fits in here too.
Yes, Smith's ideas on how rational self-interest operating in a free market drives national wealth are presented as a natural economic expression of this same philosophical trajectory.
But this wasn't the path taken everywhere.
No, the source draws a sharp contrast with continental Europe. Despite Aristotle's rescue by Aquinas, Platonic-style philosophy, emphasizing mind over reality, is said to have returned with force. And it was joined, crucially, by the ideas of Immanuel Kant.
Who gets a very negative assessment.
Extremely negative. The book quotes Ayn Rand's famous assessment of Kant as the most malignant man in history.
Why such strong language? What's the critique?
The source adopts Rand's view, presenting Kant's idealism, his argument that our minds structure reality rather than just perceiving it directly, and his denial of fundamental axioms like existence exists, as laying the groundwork for a dangerous subjectivism.
Need to.
According to the author's analysis, this opened the door to ideological constructs built not on reality, but on subjective interpretations, emphasizing authority, collective feeling, and obedience over individual reason. The source explicitly connects this Kantian lineage, via figures like Fichte and Hegel, directly to the collectivist ideologies of the 19th and 20th centuries: communism, fascism, Nazism, systems based on the collective, the state, and coercion.
Wow. So the conclusion of this historical sweep
Is that the unprecedented prosperity and progress of the modern era are a direct result of the parts of the world that did embrace, at least to some extent, man's rational nature and institutionalize the protection of individual rights, following that Aristotelian Lockean path.
Okay. A powerful, if controversial, historical framework. Now, the book uses this lens to look specifically at Brazil.
Exactly. Having laid out this philosophical history, it zeroes in on Brazil and asks, why has this country, specifically, had such a difficult and often tragic relationship with the ideas of liberty, reason, and capitalism?
And the diagnosis starts way back.
Right from the beginning, from this perspective. Brazil's history is described as being under constant coercion. Portuguese colonization was founded on feudalism and mercantilism systems that inherently prioritize the state, its dictates, and its favors over private enterprise and individual initiative.
Were there attempts to break free?
The source points to several, but argues they were ultimately unsuccessful in changing the fundamental structure. There was the Dutch interlude, showing some economic dynamism before they were expelled. Insurgencies like Tiradentes aimed for more autonomy but were crushed.
What about entrepreneurs?
Figures like Barão de Mauá, who tried to build industry through private means in the 19th century, were, according to this account, systematically boycotted and undermined by the imperial government and its favored interests.
So even major changes didn't shift the core mentality.
That's the argument. Even the abolition of slavery, the fall of the monarchy, various liberal revolts, they failed to fundamentally alter the state-centric structure and the prevailing mentality. Brazil remained, in this view, a country defined by privileges granted by a powerful central government, a kind of persistent feudal or mercantilist system in modern dress.
And the Republic era, starting 1889.
Saw the significant influence of positivism via Auguste Comte. Positivism, remember, promoted altruism as a duty and favored a kind of scientific, top-down authoritarian governance. Not exactly fertile ground for individualism.
Then came Vargas.
The Vargas era saw Brazil openly flirt with fascism during the Estado Novo period. Even its alignment in World War II is presented as pragmatic, driven by U.S. pressure, not a principled stand for freedom.
And after Vargas.
Post-Vargas populism brought further state expansion and increasing socialist-inspired reforms, reflecting global trends, but also Brazil's own interventionist leanings. The economic debates were dominated by developmentalists like Simonson and Furtado, who believed the state must lead economic growth, versus market advocates like Eugenio Goudin. The interventionists, the source stresses, consistently won the political battles.
This leads into the Cold War period.
Yes. João Goulart's government pushed even further with collectivist initiatives, nationalizations, and land reform proposals just before the military coup in 1964.
How does the book analyze the military coup itself?
This is a really critical and controversial part of the analysis. While often framed, especially initially, as restoring order or fighting communism, the source argues it quickly became a dictatorship that suppressed any genuine liberalizing spirit. The regime focused on strengthening state control, censorship, and state-owned enterprises.
So not a fight for freedom.
From the author's viewpoint, emphatically no. It wasn't a genuine fight for freedom against collectivism, but rather a struggle by one group to capture the state for its own brand of interventionist control. He argues it led to a system remarkably similar in its reliance on coercion to what it claimed to oppose. He even compares the state intelligence organs of the time, like DIP and DOPS, to infamous systems like the Stasi or KGB to underscore the level of pervasive state control he believes existed.
So the recurring theme for Brazil's history is
Always state-centric, always supported by powerful corporatist interests, businesses seeking favors, and clientelist networks benefiting from state largesse. The Enlightenment ideas of individual liberty, reason, and limited government just never took full root or transformed Brazil's core structures, according to this analysis.
Okay, given that difficult history, the book then asks why. Why does capitalism seem to lose the cultural and political battle in Brazil, even when its economic benefits seem clear elsewhere?
Right. And the author identifies what he sees as the core issue, a deeply embedded doctrine of altruism in Brazilian culture.
Altruism as the problem. How so?
The pervasive idea, he argues, taught from childhood, is that self-sacrifice is inherently good, noble, virtuous, and that pursuing one's own rational self-interest, which often gets unfairly labeled simply as egoism or greed, is inherently bad, selfish, immoral.
And this undermines capitalism because
capitalism, in the objectivist view, is fundamentally based on rational self-interest, voluntary exchange for mutual benefit, and individual achievement. If the moral foundation condemns self-interest, the system built on it can't gain ethical acceptance. In Brazil, he adds, egoism is often falsely equated with getting profit through force or fraud, muddying the waters further.
And this doctrine of altruism leads where politically?
The source argues it inevitably leads to a collectivist society built upon the appealing but ultimately destructive concept of social justice.
Okay, let's unpack social justice as the source defines it here. What are its components?
He breaks it down into two key related ideas. First, assistentialismo, roughly, welfare or assistentialism. The idea that people have rights to goods or services they haven't produced or earned themselves, and that these rights must be fulfilled by the sacrifice of others, typically enforced through state redistribution, taxes, or social pressure.
The source objects
Because, from this perspective, wealth isn't just there to be distributed, it has to be created by individual thought and effort. Assistentialism, therefore, fundamentally involves confiscating wealth from those who created it to give to those who didn't. It views this as inherently unjust.
Okay, that's assistentialism. What's the second component?
Igualitarismo, egalitarianism. The belief that social inequality, usually meaning economic inequality, is inherently immoral and must be erased or leveled by the state.
And the problem with that, according to the book,
is that it ignores fundamental reality. Metaphysically, individuals are different in talents, abilities, drive, choices. Epistemologically, they possess distinct minds and make different decisions leading to different outcomes. Focusing on equal outcomes, or even abstract equal opportunities, ignores that real opportunities arise from reality interacting with individual consciousness, effort, and action. Trying to force equality denies individuality and requires massive coercion.
So these ideas, social justice, assistentialism, egalitarianism, where do they lead society in this view?
They pave the road to servitude, he argues. They lead inevitably to the hypertrophy of the state, an overgrown, overbearing state, because the state is the only entity with the power to enforce this redistribution and equalization. It perverts the government's only legitimate role, protecting rights, into one of controlling lives and distributing wealth.
And the critique extends beyond just obvious socialist ideas.
Yes, it's quite broad. He connects this path to pragmatic utilitarianism in thinkers like Mill, Rawls, and Dewey. And maybe surprisingly for some listeners, he argues that even proposals for state intervention put forth by figures often seen as more liberal or free market.
Like who?
Like Milton Friedman's idea for school vouchers, or Friedrich Hayek's proposal for a negative income tax or basic income floor.
Why critique those? They're often seen as market-friendly ways to help the poor.
Because, the source argues, however well-intentioned, they still fundamentally involve immoral distributivist policies. They still require the state to coerce some people, taxpayers, producers, to provide benefits for others. The principle of coercion remains, even if the mechanism seems less intrusive.
So this whole system creates a kind of
A zero-sum game, as the source calls it. Social justice and the welfare state, from this perspective, create cognitive dissonance. They deny human nature, rational self-interest, promote self-sacrifice as a virtue, reward political pull and intimidation over production, and fundamentally justify coercion as a means to a supposed good end.
zero-sum mean.
For one person, a non-producer receiving benefits, to gain, another person, a creator of value, must lose something, usually through forced expropriation via taxes or regulation. It pits citizens against each other.
And how is this system sustained, according to the book?
Through fear and guilt. Creators of value, seeing their success penalized and effectively criminalized, often learn to hide their achievements, fearing expropriation or social condemnation. This leads to a kind of passive compliance, what Ayn Rand famously termed the sanction of the victims. People accept the premises that lead to their own exploitation. Rooted in that deep collectivist programming, the idea that the individual is just a dispensable fragment of a larger whole society, rather than a sovereign end in himself.
And anti-capitalists exploit this.
The source argues they deliberately frame economics as zero-sum to advance their agenda. Wealth creators are painted as villains, accused of social injustice, and targeted for expropriation. He even notes that heirs of inherited wealth, often steeped in this culture of altruism and guilt, become particularly easy targets for this narrative, and sometimes its biggest funders.
What's the alternative presented?
The alternative is a genuinely civilized society operating under what the source calls the merchant's principle.
Which means
Respect for individual privacy, reliance entirely on free, voluntary interactions and exchanges, explicit exclusion of all forms of coercion, state or private. It's framed as a positive sum, win-win game, based on creating value and voluntarily exchanging it for mutual benefit, no force, no fraud, and crucially, no demands for self-sacrifice.
So, summing up the path to prosperity from this viewpoint.
Reality as the objective source of knowledge. Reason as the only valid means of gaining that knowledge. Individual rights, especially property rights, as the necessary condition for human existence in society. And coercion as the fundamental evil that must be identified and fought relentlessly. These aren't just opinions, the source argues. They derive logically from fundamental philosophical axioms about existence and consciousness.
Okay, a very clear, very defined perspective. Now, given this whole analysis of Brazil's history and the critique of collectivism, the book turns to the story of the Brazilian liberal movement itself.
Yes, and the author frames it using the term late Enlightenment, meaning that Brazil, in his view, remains stuck in a kind of intellectual darkness, an age of darkness mentality, dominated by statism and collectivism much longer than nations that prospered earlier did.
And the intellectual climate was hostile.
Extremely hostile, according to his description. The dominant culture and academia were poisoned by a mix of influences deeply antagonistic to individualism, reason, classical liberalism, and capitalism. He lists continental rationalism, counter-Enlightenment thought, skepticism, German idealism, especially Kant and Hegel, positivism, and later movements like the Frankfurt School, existentialism, and postmodernism, which he argues attack the very foundations of language and objective truth.
So classical liberalism didn't stand much chance.
It struggled immensely. Even what was discussed as liberalism often fell into the category of social liberalism thinkers like José Guilherme Richier trying to synthesize Keynes and Mill, or debating roles of social justice theories. These were still operating within a framework the author fundamentally critiques as collectivist or statist.
Okay, then came the end of the military regime in the mid-'80s.
Yes, the exhaustion of the military government around 1984 and the transition back to constitutional democracy. But the source emphasizes the heavy negative legacy left behind.
Such as?
Massive statization of the economy, deeply entrenched corporatism, persistent hyperinflation that destroyed savings, a generation of potential liberal leaders who had been suppressed or exiled, and perhaps most importantly, collectivism and subjectivism were pervasive in universities, media, and cultural institutions. Businesses and ordinary workers suffered under arbitrary rules and economic chaos. He even mentions things like compulsory government loans forced on citizens just to travel abroad as an example of the overreach.
And this was happening why?
While the rest of the world, or significant parts of it, seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. You had Reagan in the U.S., Thatcher in the U.K. enacting market reforms. Countries like Japan and post-war Germany had rebuilt successfully, the source argues, precisely by adopting civilized institutions that respected private property and market principles.
The author saw this contrast firsthand.
Yes, his own experience living and studying in the U.S. during part of this period reinforced his view that a different path, based on individual liberty and free markets, was not only possible, but demonstrably successful.
But Brazil's path, after the dictatorship,
continued down the road of populism and interventionism, according to the source. A succession of populist, demagogic governments failed to tackle the fundamental problems and often made them worse.
He mentions the Plano Cruzado in 1986 specifically.
Yes, as a prime example of the flawed thinking. It was an economic shock plan with price freezes that attacked the symptoms of inflation, rising prices, rather than the cause, government money printing. And crucially, it was widely supported, even cheered, by a society exhibiting what he calls that sanction of the victims mentality, people believing they were making necessary sacrifices for the common good, even as the plan violated property rights and caused massive distortions.
And he shares a story about confronting the finance minister.
A very telling anecdote. He confronted the finance minister, Dilson Funaro, at a meeting of FIDESP, a major business federation. He delivered a strong principled critique based on economic logic and individual rights, arguing the plan was fundamentally irrational and doomed to fail.
How was that received?
He faced immediate and significant backlash, particularly from the corporatist-minded business leaders present who were publicly supporting the plan, perhaps hoping for favors or fearing government reprisal. But the punchline is that later, after the Plano Cruzado inevitably collapsed in failure, that same business leader who had most vocally criticized him actually called him up to apologize, admitting the author had been entirely right, both about the plan and about the detrimental corporatist mindset that enabled it.
That highlights a lack of
Ethical debate, the source emphasizes. Society applauded coercion. Entrepreneurship was viewed with suspicion, almost criminalized by arbitrary regulations. He characterizes this whole period, the 1980s, as a true lost decade for Brazil's development, wasted due to bad ideas.
Then came the new constitution in 1988. How's that viewed?
As basically codifying this problematic trajectory. It formalized the mixed economy model, which the source sees as inherently unstable and unjust. He argues it explicitly curbed free initiative, significantly diluted the concept of private property by adding a vague, subjective social function clause, and essentially buried any realistic hope for a truly free market economy in Brazil for a long time. The result, in his analysis, increased poverty for the masses and concentrated wealth not through productive achievement, but through political connections, and state favors clientelism.
And what did this mean for the liberal movement itself?
A major setback. A weakening. Some of the early liberal institutes that had emerged actually closed down during this period. Businessmen who had supported them either went bankrupt due to the economic chaos or simply gave up the ideological fight, disillusioned by the political climate.
But the flame didn't go out completely.
No, and this is where the story shifts towards our revival. The source highlights the vital individuals and, crucially, institutions that persevered, kept the ideas of liberty alive, and eventually sparked a significant resurgence of the movement, particularly among the youth.
Which institutions were key?
The Instituto de Estudos Empresarios, i.e. in Porto Alegre, is singled out for playing a crucial, perhaps indispensable, role. They consistently hosted debates featuring diverse viewpoints, created an innovative Sombra shadow program where young associates closely followed and assisted visiting speakers. The author himself did this, shadowing the Austrian economist Israel Kirzner. And they made a strategic move to hold their major annual event, the Forum de Liberdade, Liberty Forum, inside university campuses, deliberately aiming to engage directly with young people in an environment often dominated by leftist thought.
And the IE model spread.
Yes. Its success and structure inspired the creation of new independent liberal groups across Brazil, often founded by former IE members. It acted as a kind of incubator.
International connections mattered too.
Absolutely essential, the source notes. The Mont Pelerin Society, the international gathering of liberal thinkers founded by Hayek, is mentioned as an important intellectual anchor point. He shares the anecdote about Ludwig von Mises calling some interventionist colleagues there a bunch of socialists to illustrate the internal debates even within liberalism. And economists from the Austrian school like Schumpeter, Hayek, Mises, and Kerzner actually lectured in Porto Alegre, directly influencing a new generation with ideas often ignored in Brazilian universities.
Then came more direct political action.
Yes, the source points to the rise of new groups and significantly direct political engagement. The creation of the Partido Novo, New Party, is cited a party explicitly founded on liberal principles in which the author himself was involved in the early stages.
And activism within universities.
A major development. He highlights the success of student leaders like Marcel Van Hatten at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, UFRGS, in organizing and actually winning student government elections, breaking the decades-long hegemony of leftist groups on campus. That was a huge symbolic victory.
Other key institutes mentioned.
The Instituto Literais do Amanhã, ILA, in Vitoria, Espírito Santo, is mentioned as being particularly effective and strong in systematically teaching objectivist philosophy alongside broader liberal ideas. The historic Instituto Liberal, IL, founded earlier, was also revitalized by a younger, more energetic generation taking leadership roles.
The author himself remained involved.
Yes, he recounts being invited back onto the IE Council at one point, specifically because his consistent, sometimes radical defense of pure objectivist principles was seen as a necessary counterweight against a perceived drift towards more moderate social democratic ideas within the institution itself.
When did this revival really gain momentum?
The source places the renewed energy within the context of the later years of the Lula government and then the Dilma Rousseff government. Widespread youth dissatisfaction, particularly emerging around the large street protests of 2013, created an opening for alternative ideas.
Smaller groups played a role, too.
Definitely. He mentions smaller, more focused clubs like the Club Miss Rand and the Club Libertario dos Pampas, led by figures like Carla Pereira in Porto Alegre. They hosted important debates, sometimes showcasing internal disagreements within the broader liberal libertarian movement, like a debate the author participated in on intellectual property rights against representatives from the Instituto Mises Brazil. This showed intellectual ferment.
And the movement spread beyond the state capitals?
Yes. That's highlighted as significant. Liberal clubs inspired by the IE model started popping up in interior cities, like the Club Farroupilha in Rio Grande do Sul. Their leaders, like Gabriel Lorenzen, Guilherme Freire, and Felipe Camaçaro, who later became politicians, successfully applied these organizational strategies. A major symbolic victory was winning the Student Directory election, DCE, at the large federal university in Santa Maria, UFSM, with their Libertas slate, proving these ideas could win even in traditionally left-leaning university environments far from the main centers.
What about reaching a broader audience?
The emergence of Brazil Paralelo is noted as a major factor. As an influential audiovisual producer creating documentaries and content promoting liberal and conservative ideas, they reached a huge audience outside traditional academic or activist circles. The author himself lectured for them.
And Ayn Rand's books became more popular.
Yes, there was a noticeable increase in market demand for her books. Publishing houses like LVM Editora and Vide Editorial made significant efforts to translate and publish not just her famous novels like Atlas Shrugged, but also her non-fiction philosophical works. The source mentions specific titles like Philosophy, Who Needs It, and The Virtue of Selfishness, and highlights the contemporary relevance of The Return of the Primitive. The Anti-Industrial Revolution, Leonard Peikoff's systematic book Objectivism. The philosophy of Ayn Rand and his recorded lectures are also cited as crucial resources for deeper study that became more available.
The author himself was active lecturing.
Yes, he mentions giving lectures at various IFLs, Institutos Frederick List, similar to IEE, in other states like São Paulo and Florianopolis, and participating in university events at places like UCS, Caxias do Sul, and UFSM Santa Maria, spreading the ideas directly.
Any major events consolidating the movement.
A significant milestone highlighted is the Ayn Rand Conference Brazil, held in Porto Alegre in 2019. This was a big deal because it brought international speakers from the Ayn Rand Institute, ARI, based in the U.S. together with key figures from the Brazilian liberal movement, including politicians who had emerged from it like Lorenzen Camaçaro, Pedro Duarte Afonso Gomes, and Marcel Van Hatten. It showed a growing confidence and international connection. Other events like the I Conferencia Liberal in Rio de Janeiro, honoring the liberal pioneer Donald Stewart Jr., supported by Students for Liberty Brazil, SFLB, also signaled this revitalization and networking.
The author eventually stepped back from formal roles.
Yes, he mentions his eventual withdrawal from the IE Council in 2020, listing some of the recent presidents he advised during his final tenure. But he shares a particularly emotional moment from attending an event for young liberals, IFLBH Jovim, in Belo Horizonte in 2022. Seeing the energy, intelligence, and commitment of this new generation discussing these ideas, he describes it as a powerful, moving confirmation that the decades of often lonely work defending these challenging philosophical principles had been worthwhile.
Which led to his decision to
focus his energy. He decided to withdraw from his formal roles in the various institutions in 2022 to concentrate specifically on writing this book we're discussing and on giving lectures and teaching courses, consolidating his own contribution to the ongoing intellectual battle.
Okay, so pulling all this together, the source brings us back to this core idea of Brazil still experiencing a late Enlightenment.
Yes, and it's worth clarifying what the author means by that term again. Late Enlightenment signifies that Brazil, in his view, remains stuck in a state of intellectual darkness, that age of darkness mentality dominated by statism, collectivism, and irrationalism for much longer than nations that embraced reason and liberty earlier and consequently prospered. It's a state where individual potential, purposes, talents, dreams are systematically stifled by ignorance, by people evading reality, by outright oppression from a coercive state, and by a pervasive lack of philosophical clarity and courage from those in positions of power or influence.
And Objectivism's role in changing this is not direct political action.
Not primarily, according to this perspective. Objectivism itself doesn't directly liberate societies through political organizing alone. Its function is deeper. It provides the necessary philosophical justification for freedom. It explains why freedom is necessary and good, based on the nature of reality and the requirements of human life.
So societies become free when?
According to this view, societies are freed only when a sufficient number of individuals choose to be free in their own minds first. When they understand what freedom truly requires, reason, independence, rights, and are willing to fight for it based on clear, rational principles.
And the role of the liberal movement and spreading objectivism within it
is seen as aiming to illuminate that path, to provide the intellectual ammunition, the moral certainty, for those individuals who are ready to choose reason and liberty over conformity and coercion.
So the ultimate goal is mental liberation.
Exactly. As the author frames it, the ultimate goal is the liberation of individuals' minds, freeing them from the unexamined dogmas, the harmful prejudices, the paralyzing fears, and the destructive logical fallacies that hold them captive, often without them even realizing it.
And this mental liberation is the prerequisite.
It's presented as the necessary first step, allowing individuals to then use their freedom effectively in the world to build productive lives without being burdened by irrational guilt or crippling resentment.
And that brings us pretty much to the end of this fascinating and definitely specific deep dive. We've taken quite a journey, guided by this particular book, from the foundational branches of philosophy looking at reality, knowledge, ethics, through an objectivist lens, through a sweeping and frankly quite critical historical narrative, contrasting paths of reason and coercion, and finally focusing intensely on the specific, often challenging history of Brazil and the ongoing struggle for liberty there, all illuminated by this objectivist perspective presented by the author.
Yeah, and throughout, we've seen how this source consistently emphasizes the absolute critical importance of individual choice, the disciplined use of reason as our only tool for survival and flourishing, the unwavering fight against all forms of coercion, whether private or governmental, and the rational pursuit of personal happiness and individual flourishing as the fundamental moral purpose of life and the necessary basis, not only for a good individual life, but ultimately for a prosperous and truly civilized society.
So, drawing from that core message we've explored today, this idea from the source material, that the fight for liberty fundamentally begins by liberating individual minds from the grip of unexamined dogmas and fallacies. Here is a final thought for you, the listener, to consider as we wrap up. According to the perspective presented in this book, what specific dogmas, prejudices, cultural assumptions, or logical fallacies might you need to critically examine in your own thinking in order to truly claim your own intellectual independence, your freedom, and pursue your own flourishing?
That's a wrap for this episode of The Deep Dive, exploring radical ideas, grounded in reality, driven by reason, built on self-esteem, rational self-interest, and laissez-faire capitalism, produced by Bob Rash.
We'll be back next week. Until then, stay curious, stay free. Enjoy music. pursuit of happiness.